David Chickey is the publisher, designer, and editorial director of Radius Books, a nonprofit publishing company based in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Chickey co-founded Radius in 2007 while working as a graphic designer and curator in various capacities in the art world. I will hand it over to you, David, to tell us more about Radius and your special, why it's special. All right, mute, Betsy.
Thank you, Betsy. Nice to meet all of you guys. There are a lot of familiar faces out there, so it's nice to see you all. Thank you to FotoFika and to Betsy and to Anne and John for asking me to do this. I'm happy to be here. You know, when Betsy asked me to do this, I prepped a bit of a PDF sort of that runs into sort of the general kind of overview of Radius's history. And looking out there now at who's here, I guess I'm questioning, and I'll just pose this question to all of you: how much of this conversation do you want me to focus on sort of how Radius is structured or what its history is, or should I talk a little bit more about the overlap of why you asked me to do this, which is about, you know, memories and history of food? I had actually included the Beaumont Newhall book in the presentation, and I can go into some of the history of how that book came about and what we did to do that book. But maybe if it's okay and we can be this casual, give me a little feedback in terms of what would be the best usage of this short amount of time for me to talk about.
Does anyone want to jump in? Because I mean, I do feel, as Colleen says, Beaumont book. You know, I think you should run with it, David, the way you want to do it. I had also envisioned fantasy of a group of 100 people who would be like, donation program, we need to tell the world about this. And I do feel like the world needs to know about it, but I'm going to just, my opinion and Colleen's opinion, I think you should go with what feels good to you right now.
Okay, well, I'll give the basic overview. I'm going to share my screen with this PDF that we prepped so that you can look at books more than me. So did that work? Can you see that? So, you know, Radius was founded in, as I think many of you know, in 2007. There were a group of 4 of us in Santa Fe who were having conversations about the state of publishing and about where we were thinking about the possibilities of going. And I think, you know, when I reflect back on that now, I actually did just give an interview late last week to an Italian magazine, and one of the questions they asked was, what are the basic premises of Radius and how much have they changed since you were founded? And I'm just going to jump to this sort of listing of basically the major points of what we were founded on, and I really don't think it's changed much in 14 years. I think these 3 premises are sort of the core of how we started, why we started a nonprofit book company, and why we continue. And just to kind of quickly run through them, I had, as Betsy mentioned, I had been a designer. I had worked on book design for a lot of other for-profit publishers, bigger publishing houses. And one of the things that I felt wasn't necessarily a focus of those houses was this idea that really the whole core of the book, the idea of what the book could be, comes back to the inspiration of the art itself. I say all the time that our books are only as good as the work that we publish. And I do mean that because I think when we publish the books that we do and we do our job right, it's really about using the art, whatever medium that is, as the inspiration for what we do and making sure that we're translating that into some sort of book form that gets that message across. I should add that from the beginning, we have made it a big point to publish books that are across all media in terms of the way in which art is made. A lot of people in the photography community think of us as photography publishers. We have, of course, published a lot of photography, but about half of our books have been published on art of other media. And as many of you know, Darius Himes was one of the 4 original founders when we founded this. And in the beginning, Darius was really the first ever paid employee of Radius when he worked at Radius. And of course, Darius came from the photo world. And when Darius left to go work at Frankel, about 3 or 4 years in, I got a lot, and we sent out the press release to say that Darius was leaving. I got a lot of feedback from people in the photo community, contacting Radius and saying, "Oh my God, Darius is leaving. What are you going to do? Are you going to close down? Are you going to, what's going to happen to Radius in the future?" And I got kind of an equal amount of feedback from people in the art community writing and saying, "Who's Darius?" So it is kind of this funny sort of like indication of the overlap or the lack of overlap between sort of the art world and the photo world, and how kind of fascinating to me that these worlds are still divergent, but they are, and it's an interesting sort of reality. Nonetheless, regardless of what we publish, it comes back to the sort of inspiration of the work itself, and I hope that's reflected in every book that we make. Which gets to the second point here, which is that I think there's an incredible opportunity in the book itself in terms of an object, what it is, what it can be, how that medium can express things. Because we're dealing in the art world, we're often looking at books that are in tandem with exhibitions, and I think it's amazing and beautiful what exhibitions can do. Seeing work that's made to be experienced in the flesh is an amazing thing, and seeing that is incredible. And I don't ever even think of trying to compete with that. But books can do things that exhibitions can't. And one of the biggest things they can do is they have legs, and they can travel, and they can reach a bigger audience, and they can live for a longer period of time. I mean, even John, with you talking about the playing cards just now, that's something that some of the students are talking about, that it actually exists as an object that can carry forward for a longer period of time. So, always coming back to that idea that the book is an object that can be played with creatively, engagingly, and then therefore be consumed by whoever gets it as something that's more engaging and gets, at the end of the day, a more intimate relationship between you and the work that we're publishing is a big part of it. And then maybe the point of that started all of this, and why in many ways we're structured as a nonprofit, is from the beginning. I had gone to a publishing seminar before we ever founded Radius, and it was a panel discussion, and the panelists were all for-profit art book publishers. And they were talking about this crisis that was happening at the time. This is about 17 years ago, I think, that libraries, they used to be able to count on libraries, a network of over 2,000 libraries in this country that would buy pretty much anything they ever published for their collections. And that was beginning to diminish, and has continued to diminish over the years. And this was a crisis point conversation for those publishers because they were losing sales. And I remember sitting in that room and listening to that conversation, and first of all, wondering why libraries were not buying copies of our books. And there are many answers to that question, but one of the biggest answers to that question was that as library budgets were cut, the easiest thing for them to stop buying was the most expensive books on their list. And that generally meant art books. So this idea then was, how do we reopen that channel? If libraries want books, then we should be figuring out a way to get them to them if they can't afford to buy them. And that's sort of at the core of how Radius was started. We now have this donation program, and we donate every book that we publish, we donate to a network of libraries, and now growingly school programs that want the books that we do. The libraries are mostly rural and urban. They're not necessarily big, large, well-funded libraries, and that includes all 50 states. So that's a little bit of a general overview of Radius. This is our space. If anybody's ever comes through Santa Fe, please come by and see us. We have all the copies of the books here, and you're welcome to come by and peruse copies. This is sort of a vintage picture of an exhibition that we had probably 4 or 5 years ago, pre-COVID. And then I just have some examples of some books that we've published, maybe to just sort of talk about how we think about and conceive of and try to think about books, just as an example to sort of illuminate some of the concepts and ideas that I was just sharing. And again, I'll emphasize, if this is a casual conversation or not, it's not a huge group. If if you have questions, you can leave them in the chat and I'll see them, or you can, unmute yourself and ask a question. I'm really open and easy with interruptions and questions if you have them. But otherwise, I'm just going to run through a few books that we've published, some more recent than others. But these are books that I just picked because they sometimes help kind of share, if you're not that familiar with what we do, how we sort of try to push the envelope a little bit in terms of what a book can be. So this is a book that we published with a Japanese photographer named Yamamoto Masao. I don't know how many of you are aware of his work. He tends to, his work is the physical manifestation of his work are small prints. He makes them handmade in his studio. He's often playing with them a little bit. He will tint them. He will take, tea and stain the edges. He's been known to take these smaller photographs and put them in his pocket over a period of a few days so that they begin to crinkle around the edges or have this sort of wear to them. And when he has exhibitions, he often will do these somewhat collaged sort of collection of these smaller prints on a wall. And that became the inspiration for how we thought about the book itself. So the name Tori is Japanese for bird. And so when we started this was an idea that he had about loosely thinking about images that either include birds and they don't all have birds in them, although he photographs birds a lot, but they have some sort of tangential relationship, at least in his mind, to this idea of birds and how they exist in the landscape and how they play with the work. So the book itself is in some ways relatively traditional, but we're playing with where the image sits in the book and whether it sits closer to the gutter of the book or farther out. So the book begins to sort of have this quality of a journal or something that's very much an artist book that he's fabricated. And then one of the things that we wanted to do was there's 7 images in this book that are actually hand tipped in. So they're printed on separate paper and tipped into the book in different ways. The one here that you're seeing is tipped into the gutter. The one after it is actually tipped in so that its edge is flush with the book, so that you get this sort of collaging element. There's also this, which is a big gatefold that opens so that you get a little bit of change of scale and placement and play inside the book. So like I said, just sort of a brief overview. This, coming from the art world, is a completely different kind of project. This book, called Black Dolls, is the documentation of a personal collection of a woman named Deborah Neff, who has spent about 30, almost 40 years now, collecting these dolls, which are late 19th century and early 20th century. These are objects that were mainly made by slaves for the generally white children in their charge. And they were made in their own resonance, so they are Black, but they are these incredible documentations of so many complicated and interesting issues from our past and from our history as a country. I'll get back to that, but you can see we actually took these objects. We didn't bring this book actually to Paris Photo when we were there, and there was a French publisher who was there who had really been fond of this book and asked me why I didn't have the book. And I said, well, it's not a photography book, it's a collection of these historic objects. And he said, well, didn't they all have to be photographed? I mean, isn't every book a photography book at the end of the day? Which I always think about when I look at this book, because we did have the entire collection re-photographed for the book. And the photography is really great because it really silhouettes and emphasizes these things as objects. They were photographed against white backgrounds and Black backgrounds. But you get a sense of how amazing these things are, how interesting they are, their cultural history. When we started talking about the design of the book, I actually went back to the bindery. We covered the material of the cover in cloth, and then we cut the edges, and which is something that you would never consciously intentionally do, because the cloth then frays. But I did it intentionally so that the cloth would fray, and the edges of the book pull away, and they begin to have this very direct relationship reference to the objects themselves, which are loved objects, they're old objects, and they are almost universally frayed around the edges. So it's a way in which a book can sort of begin to echo and reflect the content that's inside that book, which is something that, at least as a designer, I'm super engaged with. The other component of the book, and I think what makes the book particularly interesting, is that Debbie also started collecting photography of the era that would have these objects in the photographs. And she found quite a few. I mean, we're talking, early time in photography, where to choose to have a photograph made was a big decision, and what you chose to include in that photograph also was incredibly important. So she found a lot of photographs of essentially looking for photographs of people with dolls, whether they were children or not. She found mostly photographs of children holding these dolls. And what's really incredibly telling and fascinating about this collection is that she found a lot of photographs of Black girls holding white dolls that they had collected, and white girls holding both white dolls and then these Black dolls that were generally made for them by the women that were their nannies or caretakers or people in their life, but never found any photographs of Black children holding Black dolls, which gets to this core of perception of value, or what you choose to have in a photograph. It's a stunning and shocking sort of testament of the extreme racism in this country, and the history and the vestiges, and how you can find it in places like this. In a completely different realm, and I'll do just a quick talk about this. Rudolf de Krennis was a Swiss painter who died much too young, and we did a book about 3 or 4 years after he died. Brilliant painter, very, very minimal work. Most of his pieces in their final iterations were either gray, blue, or black, but they were built from insanely complicated underpainting processes of colors that would go for hundreds of coats of colors. So that when you experienced his work in an exhibition like this one, when you walked into the room, the perception was that you walked into a room of 3 gray paintings, when in fact, if you took the time and spent a little time in the room, within 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes, and you start to just not focus on the work, but just be with the work, the underpainting starts to resonate. And so after you spend enough time with that work, you could point to the room and you could say, oh, yellow, green, blue, the paintings, which appear to be gray, all kind of have this glowing resonance of the colors that are there in the underpainting. And so again, in terms of thinking about how to publish this work and reference the fact that the work does this without turning to too many like Photoshoppy kind of tricks, the jacket of this book, which is hard to tell in the image, is actually a semi-opaque material. It's called UPO, but it's translucent but milky. And so the jacket of the book is made from this material. The text, which is his name, which the gray of the text is based on sort of the gray of his paintings, in this very like Swiss, rigid kind of font, is silk screened on the outside of the jacket of the book. On the inside of the jacket of the book, we silk screened primary colors. And the jacket hovers just far enough away from the cover of the book itself, which is hard to see in this image too, but printed in a texture like the canvas that he would paint on. So that, and again, it doesn't necessarily come through in this photograph, but when you have the book and you spend a little time with it, those words of his name, the forms of his name start to glow slightly with the resonance of the colors like his paintings do. And so it's this whole conversation for me about how can a book begin to sort of, reference impact and play with, our perceptions. Carlos, you asked me what year published, and I'm not sure which book. I just saw that note.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was wondering about the Black Doll book.
The Black Doll book is about 7 years old at this point.
Oh, is it still available?
It's rare, but there are copies. The book, when we published it, was actually rejected. It's an interesting story about how a nonprofit evolves, and when you have boards and publications committees and all those things involved. It was a book that was actually rejected by my publications committee and board when we did the original submissions of making decisions about what we published. And it was the first time that I had ever gone back to the board and said, I disagree. This book is too important. We have to do it. And the board basically said, okay, we trust you. The work had not been photographed at that point. And so it was, I think, hard for the board to see what the book could be. And I think I could see what the book could be. But at the time that we published it, it was the best-selling book that we had ever done, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it's an interesting and beautiful book.
Thank you. Okay, so then this is a book that many of you may be more familiar with, the book that we did about 5 years ago now with an artist named Debbie Cornwall, who took these images in Guantanamo Bay. She was an attorney by trade, and she had worked with some of the detainees in Guantanamo and got permission to go there and to photograph. It is a really complicated project and complicated imagery. It's called Welcome to Camp America because Camp America is the nickname for Guantanamo within the military. What I think a lot of us don't know is that Guantanamo, I think, still has, can't remember the exact number of prisoners. At the time of the publication of this book, I think there were still like 30 or 40 prisoners there. And the military has about 15 or 1600 personnel stationed there. And so you can imagine there's not a lot for a lot of them on a regular basis to do. So it's considered, like almost a vacation type post in some ways because it's a tropical and amazing location, and it's a beautiful space. So Debbie started by taking images like these of the interior of the space itself. Her permissions she was never allowed to photograph the face of anybody in the facility, no matter who she was dealing with. So you'll see some figures in some of these images, but they never include anyone's identity or face. But she was documenting the components of this place that give it that feeling of a camp. And then also there's a gift shop. Which is insane. But you can buy, sorry about that. You can buy objects. This is one of those clasps that you would put on the edge of a table if you were at a restaurant and you wanted to hang your purse off the edge of the table. But you can get one that has a Camp America logo on it if you want to get that from the gift shop. So this book is a combination of a lot of images and a lot of compelling components. And part of why I wanted to show it is that it's one of these things where a book can encompass so many complex and disparate and different kinds of things. So we have her photographs of the space. We have the photographs she took of the items in the gift shop itself. She had actually followed 15 of the released prisoners back to the place that they were released to. It's called reinsertion when they're let go from the prison and allowed to go somewhere else. So she had photographed them. That's what this is, showing a piece of one of those photographs. That photograph underneath this is some of the officers at Guantanamo. And then there was also these archival materials that she had collected, in her experience as an attorney. And so weaving all of these materials together into a book is, I think, what sometimes makes a book so sort of fun and interesting. The piece of that puzzle to figure out what to do with the detainees that she had followed and photographed became sort of one of the hallmarks of the book itself, which we ended up, this is one of the photographs. This is a folded piece of paper. When you open it, you'll see, and I'm sorry, I don't have an image of one of the prisoners, but she photographed the prisoners where they had gone to. And then we took these, and their biographical information on one side is in Arabic, on the other side is in English. And we took those and we randomly and without any binding inserted them into the book in places. It's a literal physical reference to that reinsertion concept. So we inserted these into the book, but I have to say that as a book person and as a book lover, when you pick up this book and you start to read it, these things have a tendency to fall out. You kind of don't know what to do with them. It's annoying. And that is exactly the conceptual point that we were trying to get to, which is that's what these people have become. You don't know what to do with them. It is annoying. It's frustrating. And so it's, again, it's this way in which how can the content and the form and the relationships of a book begin to have, relationships to the work itself. And
David,
then
before you go on, could you talk just a teeny bit about, you worked pretty closely with Debbie in doing this, right? Like how did she come to you with the idea kind of all complete, or was this
I think like everything that Radius ends up doing, it's a very collaborative process. I think she was having a hard time wrapping her head around all the complexity of the project. It was her first book. And it was, so we started talking about it. And in the beginning, we really didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do with the images of the people who had been reinserted into various countries. We didn't really even know what to do, or if we would include the images of the pieces from the gift shop. We didn't know how many of the archival materials to include or how to include them. That image sort of shows that we ended up doing quite a few gatefolds with some of that archival material so that it's hidden when you're looking in the book. You have to open it, you have to find it. There's these references to how to deal with it. But that was through, working together over several months and like playing with it and trying things. And some things worked and some things didn't work. I call it listening to the work. It's sort of, you have to listen to the artwork. You have to dig into it so that you can figure out what it kind of wants to be. I know I say things like that. I feel like sometimes I've lived in Santa Fe too long, but it's this, it really is in this intuitive, creative way, this way of like trying to inhabit the work and figure out what messages it can tell you about the way in which it's better to handle it versus other ways of handling it. And I will also add this, I say this all the time, we end up making books and you end up making choices about what a book can be. I don't think there's just one way to make any book out of any, body of work. I think there's lots of good ways to do it. And hopefully we find a really good one. But I don't know that it's the only way or the only one that can be made from a body of work.
Great.
Becky, I love that you keep yours in a plastic bag. It's also that book has also gotten pretty valuable, so it's probably a good idea on a few levels.
Okay, so an archival plastic bag, we hope.
Yes, I hope. Yeah, let's hope it's archival. So then I thought, maybe mainly to your point, Betsy, this is the book that maybe made you think of us in the first place. This Beaumont's Kitchen book was happened because I was having dinner with David Scheinbaum. Many of you may know David Scheinbaum, but he was close with Beaumont, was an assistant of Beaumont's, and knew a lot about him. And he had mentioned when we were having dinner that Beaumont had I had kind of heard a few of the rumors about how close Beaumont was to food, but Beaumont actually wrote a food column in a publication called the Brightford-Pitford Post for about 4 years. He wrote it for the first year anonymously, didn't want anybody to know that he was actually the author of this. And then when enough people found out and he got enough positive response from the fact that he was writing it, he started adding a byline. And the estate held the archive of all of these columns. And at the time, it's funny for me. I have a big cooking background. I come from a family of cooks and chefs and people who are, wonderfully obsessed with food. And I really didn't realize that going back now to the 50s and 60s, that recipes, generally speaking, were not written out with ingredients and instructions in the way that the convention is so obvious to us now, that's the way all cookbooks are done. It wasn't done that way. So these columns don't have lists of ingredients and instructions on how to have things. It's just more of a description of, I take a couple of eggs and I throw them in this, and then I might think this, and I'll add a little bit of that to it. So in addition to replicating these columns themselves, so this is what you're looking at is a photograph with its natural casted shadow and natural light that we took of all of the cut pieces from the column in the archive that we reproduced in the book. I'll mention this too. I did an acetate jacket on this book because it is a cookbook, and I hoped it would be in a kitchen, and I hoped people would be using it, and I wanted it to be sort of, a little bit protected. I always liked that idea. Yeah, you can see from John holding it that it's, it catches light in the plastic. So when we started talking about imagery to include in this, we went to the era of the photographers that he was either working with at the time or that are mentioned in some of the articles. And we found images related to food. The image on the cover in this image is actually, a portrait of Beaumont that Ansel Adams took of him cooking. And clearly what you learn from this is that Ansel was, Beaumont was a huge cook. He loved food. He cooked for all the people and the photographers and the people in his life constantly. There's this great story in the book itself about he went to Paris to meet with Cartier-Bresson in prep for the plan of the show at MoMA. And when he did, he flew Air France. And on the trip home from Air France, he was served coq au vin. And he thought it was so great that he wrote to Air France to both compliment them on the coq au vin that he was served on the plane, but to also ask for the recipe. And the head chef from Air France wrote back and said, I'm so flattered that you like the coq au vin. That's my grandmother's recipe. And here's the recipe. And then the food column that Beaumont then writes shares that recipe in the book. So we took these food columns and we combined with them. I'm sorry, I went too far. Oh, sorry, maybe in the rip of the PDF for this, we didn't get many more images, but so for this book, we replicated the columns themselves so that you can read them. In some of the cases, but not all of them, we then translated that information into a traditional, what we think of now, traditional recipe form and published the recipes. My mother was a chef, and so I sent all the recipes to my mother, and my mother sent them to this whole network of friends and my extended family and other friends and people that we knew, and we had them all test the recipes. Oh, wow. So that they would actually know that they would work. And then we adjusted and revised them as needed. And then we combined them with these photographs, as I said, of the era, as well as we went to, I can't remember the exact number now, but it was 12 or 15 people who had stories related to experiences with Beaumont and food. And they told us those stories, we transcribed them and included them in the book. So the book is sort of this hybrid. It's a hybrid historical documentation. It's photo history. It's, some really great images, but it's also a cookbook.
It's great.
And I think that's probably about the amount of time that you allotted for each talk.
Yeah.
That was really fantastic.
That's so great. There's so many connections to so many things. I do think someone had a question in here, a little more broad about making choices about what you publish.
Yeah, it's a question a lot of people, ask that question, and it's in some ways, I can give you the perfunctory answer, the practical answer. The real answer is it's not easy. It's a constant conversation here. It's a constant thing in terms of what we think about. But I do, in the beginning, we engaged the entire board in the conversation, and we had a big board meeting every year when we talked about all the possible proposals that I would sort of pare down into something that was digestible in a couple of days. And we would make decisions sort of in this very collaborative way. A few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, it became clear that not every person on my board either had the time or the inclination to want to go through everything as a possibility of what we published. So we pulled a subset out of the board that we call the Publications Committee. And the Publications Committee now meets once a month. And we talk about all of these issues, and we look at proposals, and we consider what is right. We have some specific guidelines that we follow, and we followed from then. In the beginning, it was always an roughly equal amount of photography and art of other media. We didn't want to tip one way too far the other. From the very beginning, we made a very big point out of publishing the work of women. As much as I still can't believe that I say this in any sort of public forum, or that it's true, and that's why I say it, is that the art world is still way, way, way too white male dominated, and it needs to be less so. And so making a priority to publish the work of women, to publish the work of people of divergent races and backgrounds has also been a big part of it. And it's something that you have to be very conscious of, or it doesn't happen. We get still way more proposals from that side of things than we do of others. And then I'd say the other, maybe this is the answer to the Italian publisher that I didn't give, I mean, the Italian magazine, about what's changed, is that I think one of the things that we've become growingly aware of is the power of our books in the donation program specifically, and how certain kinds of books can really aid in either teachers or librarians or different kinds of ways about thinking of things. And the idea that sometimes we publish books that may or may not find as big an audience or sell to as big of an audience, but the idea to me that they can turn on, some kid in Boise, Idaho, or, that can become as big a factor of why we publish something as any of the other ones. So it all kind of plays a part of it. And Betsy, I think we've talked about, I think I've told you this story. I don't know that I've told this story in this public forum, but your book specifically, we got a call from a librarian in Louisiana, and there was a girl, I think she was 12, and the books that they hold in their library, which is true of a lot of the libraries that we donate books for, they will either make our books you can't check them out of the library. They're more valuable books. They want to make sure that the books stay in better condition. Or some of the libraries have like an overnight. If you take it out overnight, you have to bring it back the next day. And this 12-year-old girl took your book home and rechecked it out every day for 12 days in a row. And she called us just to say, we wanted you to know how much this was meaningful. And the librarian said, you should have seen her cradling the book every day that she would come back. So of course, we sent a copy of the book to the library and said, please give, please give this girl a copy of the book. But also it's just a testament to the fact that there is such a big audience out there for this kind of material, and for people that don't necessarily have access to these kinds of worlds in other ways, and books can reach them. So,
and one thing that Betsy and I were talking about before this started is the role that service plays in the production, right? So, I mean, in thinking back about these cards, like the cards came out of like trying to be of service to these students who that one student who said, I didn't get a show, but I did get these cards, and that I think thinking about like the kinds of books that you publish, just as you said, are informed by, like, truly informed by the where they're going to go, and the libraries are one of those primary locations, right? So it's it's not just nonprofit, right? Like there's plenty of nonprofit publishers. It's mission driven, right? It's impact driven, where those are things that your board and the selection committee are thinking about in advance of publishing anything.
Yeah.
Did
Carlos,
I just say what you said?
No, that was great. Carlos just asked if COVID has changed the cost of publishing, and yeah, the answer is yes. It's complicated, the whole process, obviously. It's complicated everything everywhere. There's supply chain issues. The cost of paper has increased. That's like the most basic part of it. But there's also huge increases in the cost of shipping and freight. There's, more than cost, there's the practicality. We're starting to come out of, but for the last 6-8 months, we've been in the midst of a global supply chain crisis in terms of supplies for making books. There was a global shortage of book board. Couldn't get any book board. There were binderies all over the world that were having to close down because they didn't have the board. In some cases, they didn't have glue. There was problems. I did one of the books that I printed this summer. I did a jacket of a different kind of material, and that material just, you could not get no matter what. So there's all kinds of issues, but yes, it's affected cost, but it's also affected time.
And
Do we
then,
have,
yeah,
go ahead, John.
Becky has a question in the chat. If you want to talk about how you fund Radius, or do you want to say that?
Oh, no, I'm happy to talk. Do you guys have another hour? Do you want to listen to me talk about funding
No,
for
we have
nonprofit?
we have
yeah.
exactly 8 minutes and a hard out. So
Yeah. It's, like any nonprofit, we fund it however we can. We have a whole different realm of the ways in which we raise funds for books. We have our general funding that we look for general contributions, and we do everything from, like other nonprofits, we have a fundraiser every other year. We do special projects that we publish in an attempt to raise funds. For the books themselves, then we look for grants as much as possible from foundations or from individuals that can go towards the publishing of a book. We often do limited editions, which we sell to raise funds to do a book. What else? Am I answering your question, Becky? I don't know that I
am. Because we don't have a lot of time, and there's so many things, David, it's great. I love the story behind the cookbook and all these dimensions. I'm reminded too that one of our first guests was Allison Nordstrom, the very beginning of the pandemic, talking about the need for the physical object. And I feel like your attitude, Radius's attitude towards the book, really emphasizes that. And I think somehow that fits into everything. But I also think that we have a comment at the end, Barbara. I don't actually know, you go by B or Barbara? I'm embarrassed that I don't know, but I don't know if you want to say your comment now. You what?
Anything but Babs.
Anything but Babs. Yes.
Anything but Babs.
Okay.
Don't call me Dave.
So what I was asking was, it sounds like what you were saying in answer to Betsy's question was that when artists apply or submit to Radius, they don't really have to have their recipe fully sussed out, that they can come with the goods, the ingredients, and you see the value in that, and then you together collectively put it together.
I think you can probably tell from what I showed, just a few objects. We like collaboration. I like that process. I mean, I think, I don't expect any great artist or photographer or person working in this realm to necessarily know and or understand the possibilities within the realm of making a book object the way that we do. They don't live it the way we do. And so hopefully what we can add to the mix is this idea of what can you do with binding or paper or materials or different things. And so that becomes a collaborative process, hopefully, ideally. So, there are some publishers that really do like, a final PDF and a very fleshed out, go hire an exterior and an external designer to create something really finished. We don't really operate that way, I think, largely because I don't operate that way. I tend to think in this more open, collaborative way of what's possible.
Yeah, you're the kind of person that sends out Beaumont Newhall recipes to all of your friends and family to test out, so that
I am that person, I'm afraid. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, one of the things you talked about with the physical book is interesting because, we have you wrote a review for Katie Leonard, whose work is here.
Yes, I'm in the deck. Yes.
So you're in, and we just sent you a deck, so that's coming in the mail.
Okay, I'm looking forward to it.
But with these physical things, like when we built the site for the 2020 All-Stars, we had a great kind of tech person who built it on Google Sheets, and it's totally live and dynamic, and a student submits an image and it goes to the site, and he left and it doesn't work anymore. So really the only representation of this whole project, which started digitally, is the physical form. So
it's interesting.
So I guess we have to go. Anna's like in Italy, so she's maybe not going to be able to like cut us off the way she usually does.
I don't even know if you'll be able to hear me clearly because everything I'm hearing is very garbled. It's either sped up or choppy. But yes, I am our timekeeper. I will hold us to the 5 o'clock, but we have 2 minutes.
Yeah. Is there any last questions or comments or questions for David or?
If it's okay with you guys, I have a 3 o'clock call, so.
Okay.
We're
All right,
happy
thank-
to-
I may
we're happy
jump
to say
off.
goodbye.
David.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
This was
You guys
fantastic.
you can talk about me for a minute or two after. I'm
Yeah.
done.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
We'll talk about you
all
after
the,
you go.
all
Okay,
the, all the
sounds good.
unsaid stuff.
Okay, good. Thank
Thanks
you
so
guys.
much.
Bye,
David,
David.
thank you for your
Thank you.
generosity. We really
Yes,
David.
appreciate it. Thank
Ciao.
you so much. Take care.
Wow.
Ciao, ciao.
All right, and if you're not
Great.
on our
Thank-
mailing list, get
Yeah.
on our mailing list, and we promise not to bombard you with anything more than once a month,
Yeah. But thanks
unless
for
there's
coming.
something exciting. Thanks
And-
thanks everybody for getting here.
I do want to say that when David was talking about the Beaumont book and I started thinking about the idea of recipes and I spent today trying to write out my recipe, I became very excited about this idea. So if any of you have in the back of your mind like a recipe or something, like please, we're gonna have a place. We do have a place, but please send it to us because I think I'm excited about this idea. So send your recipes.
And we have 2 minutes. So have we talked about it the last time, but we are essentially doing a crowdsourced recipe book. We don't know what shape or format it's going to be in. And I mean, one thing David talked about was like the structure of the recipe, and we have a form that's like built for recipes in WordPress, and the structure is so solid that it's like hard to figure out what we actually want to ask of people. So yeah, we need it to be fluid enough for you to send us a short email that we can figure out. So that'll be
So
in our
coming
next
soon.
update. Coming soon.
Coming soon.
Coming soon.
All right.
Coming soon.
And
Thanks,
so-
everyone. for
Yeah,
coming.
thanks
Everybody for
everybody.
being with us. We appreciate you being in the audience today.
Thanks, Anne, for joining us from Italy. Thanks, Alana,
Yeah.
for running the boards. Thanks, everybody.